Thank you for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be invited to speak in association with World Rivers Day, especially during what happens to be the United Nations International Year of Forests. The goals of the United Nations Water for Life Decade in Canada are highly complementary to the intentions of the International Year of Forests. Our goals for the remainder of this decade of action on the world water crisis are, first of all, to dispel the myth of limitless abundance of water in Canada. Secondly, to translate scientific research outcomes into language the average person can understand and that decision makers can use to craft timely policies with respect to the management of our water resources. And finally, to bring international example to bear on water issues in Canada, which we think is quite important. I wish in this World Rivers Day presentation to offer the broadest perspective I can on water issues so that you may be able to put the water-related challenges we face first into a global context and then into a context that will allow you to appreciate the relationship that exists between our forests and the reliable supply of clean water to humanity. I hope today to demonstrate how important forests are to the hydrological future of our society and our planet. I would like to begin by declaring my biases. First of all, allow me to say that I speak for water, not for industry or forestry, agriculture, municipalities, or the oil and gas sector, but for water. Our initiative exists to give voice to water. And within this context, I wish also to say that I do not believe that we are by any means facing the end of the world, either in hydrologic or climatic terms. Fortunately, natural systems are often a great deal more resilient than we think, and people can and often do change. This in itself should provide a foundation for measured optimism about the future in our time. I would, however, like to find ways to ensure that the serious problems and unfortunate political paralyses that have emerged so widely in the world in this generation do not persist through the next. And if they do, then we really will be in trouble. As many of you already know, the global picture with respect to fresh water is not good. There are trends that are emerging that should properly demand our fullest attention. And some of these trends have even begun to appear here in Canada. The premise of this presentation is that we should be dealing seriously with emerging problems now while time and relative prosperity are on our side, so that as our population grows and our climate changes, our social and economic future is not limited by water availability and quality problems that we could have and should have addressed in better times. So, to begin, most of you already know that our blue globe is by definition a water world. It's also recognized that 97% of the water on this planet is salty, leaving only 3% of it fresh enough to sustain terrestrial life. And of that 3%, much of the world's fresh water is bound in ice or made inaccessible to us by the depth at which it resides below the surface of the earth. The same 4/1000ths of 1% of the Earth's total water sustains us as it did every civilization since the beginning of time. Earlier civilizations, however, were unable to manage their water supplies sustainably. History, we discover, is littered with the ruins of societies that declined simply because they could not overcome the effects of local resource depletion and manage the impacts of population expansions that accompanied their own initial success. And one of the biggest hydrological problems that has historically faced humanity has been deforestation, which sounds familiar, doesn't it? When we look at history, it becomes clear that we are by far the greatest hydraulic civilization of all time. By the year 2000, we had constructed some 45,000 large dams that, in combination with the hundreds of thousands of smaller structures that we built, quadrupled water storage for human purposes in only 40 years. So now, depending upon the time of year, 3 to 6 times the water that exists at any given time in the world's rivers is now stored behind giant dams. We have, in effect, replumbed much of the world to our own purposes, and yet we still do not have enough water when and where we need it. And moreover, our thirst continues to grow. Most studies cite population growth as the principal driver of increases in the global demand for water. And although there are uncertainties surrounding future population projections, and there always are, research shows that the world population is likely to grow between 2000 and 2025 by 30% and by 50% between 2000 and 2050. At a minimum, global population is expected to grow from its 2000 level of 6.5 billion to over 8 billion by 2025. And the latest UN figures suggest that our population could grow as high as 10 billion by 2050. These projections invite questions as to whether there will be sufficient water to support population growth of this magnitude. By the year 2025, the number of water-scarce countries in the world is projected to rise to 29, and the number of water-stressed countries is expected to rise to 19. And the combined population of these 48 countries is estimated to be 2.9 billion people. A study of 92 developing countries shows that as higher incomes drive improvements in diets around the world, an additional 5,200 cubic kilometers will be needed annually for agriculture by 2050. That, I should point out, is the equivalent to the flow of 20 Niles, or about 100 Colorado rivers. This is close to all the remaining surface water readily available to us on Earth. So from this, in short, we see that the picture is almost inescapably one of growing demand matched up with static or shrinking supplies. And the result, clearly and obviously, is intensifying scarcity. It's urgent that we respond now to this pressing global trend. And the reason for that is that we have discovered that we're not the only ones facing actual and potential water scarcity. There's a growing realization of nature's need for water. We now understand that nature needs water in its own right so that it can supply water to us. Breakthroughs in understanding how much water nature needs revolve around improving observations of how different kinds of ecosystems, and in particular forests, generate, capture, purify, and release water. If the world is a well, then nature is the pump that supplies water to people through that well. In order to get fresh water from nature, we need to give water to nature so that it can prime the hydrological pump. Research into the role of natural systems in the supply of water to people has led to some troubling insights. We have discovered, for example, that a full 40% of humanity is now competing directly with nature for water. And as a result, we're beginning to see some frightening convergences. If we give nature the water it needs to provide important basic ecological services, then that water will have to come from agriculture, which means people may starve. If, on the other hand, we give agriculture the water it needs to keep feeding our growing populations, then there will not be enough water to allow nature to sustain fundamental long-term planetary life support function and self-regulation. We may already be approaching a point where humanity's growing need for water will result in widespread environmental decline that may translate into impacts that, in fact, reduce our ability to feed our growing numbers. So add to this serious groundwater overdraft and accelerating deforestation and soil loss in many of the world's most important food-producing areas. Add to this widespread contamination that makes water unfit for other uses. and rapidly expanding desertification globally. And the causes and dimensions of the global water crisis suddenly become apparent. Thus, we see that the same ecosystem depletions and limitations that brought down earlier empires all over the world are now appearing on a global scale. And on top of all of this, there is the problem of climate change.